A true Holocaust had begun, including an epidemic of cancers caused by the use of depleted uranium in the first Gulf War. Iraqi hospitals were denied basic medicines, syringes, rubber gloves. When the UN humanitarian official Dennis Halliday resigned in protest, he was airbrushed from the media, or he was vilified. On the BBC, the famous presenter Jeremy Paxman shouted at him, "Aren't you just an apologist for Saddam Hussein?" The Guardian described this as one of Paxman's memorable moments. Paxman signed a £1 million book deal. The land invasion of Iraq in 2003 was a grotesque hoax, promoted by fabrications masquerading as news, as journalism, notably in the New York Times and the London Observer, both liberal newspapers. In 2009, I interviewed David Rose, the Observer journalist, whose reports claimed that Saddam Hussein was linked to al-Qaeda and 9/11 and had weapons of mass destruction. It was fake. Rose told me he'd been duped. "I can make no excuses," he said. "What happened in Iraq was a crime on a very large scale." I asked him, "Does that make journalists accomplices to war crimes?" "Yes," he replied. Such contrition is highly unusual. His newspaper never apologized. Its fawning over Blair was matched by that of its owner, The Guardian, where Blair's ascendancy was described as mythical. During the invasion of Iraq, I filmed a number of interviews with senior journalists in the United States and asked them what would have happened had the media challenged Bush's and Blair's lies instead of amplifying and echoing them. The renowned investigative journalist Charles Lewis and the former CBS anchor Dan Rather answered almost identically. "There is," said Lewis, "a very good chance we would have not have gone to war," unquote. In other words, 1 million people might have lived, 4 million people might not have fled their homes, a society might not have been dismembered, and the monstrous ISIS might not have appeared. In Britain, the propaganda role is often attributed to the right-wing tabloid press. But these have now become almost a parody, as their failed campaign against Jeremy Corbyn at the last British election demonstrated. The power of corporate media today rests in the liberal wing, notably the BBC and The Guardian, the New York Times and the Washington Post. These are respectable, they have credibility, and because they have credibility, their propaganda is the most believable and the most insidious. In 2011, the United States, France, Britain, and Norway, and the rest of NATO destroyed Libya. The principal weapon was fake news. NATO launched a total of 9,700 airstrikes and sorties, of which more than a third were aimed at civilian targets. The United Nations reported that, and I quote, "Most of the children killed were under the age of 10. The invasion of Libya and the murder of the Libyan president, Colonel Gaddafi, was justified by news that he was planning, quote, genocide against his own people in the city of Benghazi. We knew, said President Obama, that if we waited one more day, Benghazi could suffer a massacre that would have reverberated across the region and stained the conscience of the world, unquote. That was a lie, a fabrication cooked up by Islamist militias facing defeat by Libyan government forces. They told Reuters there would be, and I quote, a real bloodbath, a massacre like we saw in Rwanda, unquote. Reported on March the 14th, 2011, this provided the first spark for NATO's inferno. There was no massacre. Many of the rebels were secretly supplied and trained by Britain's SAS. Many of them went to Syria to join ISIS. Unknown to the British public, the intelligence agency MI5 had maintained Libyan terrorist assets in Manchester for 20 years. The suicide bomber allegedly responsible for the atrocity that killed 22 young people in Manchester last May was part of this anti-Gaddafi extremist group known as the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. For more than 20 years, it was cultivated and encouraged by MI5. Islamic extremism and the British government go back a long way. I recommend the new edition of the historian Mark Curtis's book, Secret Affairs. It will tell you what the news doesn't. This brings me back to Russia and Russiagate. Throughout the Cold War, we were told incessantly about a missile gap between the Russians and the United States. Russia was said to be ahead in the development of nuclear weapons. When a secret CIA report informed the White House that the Russians were actually far behind, a so-called Team B report was fabricated that put the Russians well ahead. This became front-page news, and it was fake. As a direct result, the Cold War was continued and more nuclear weapons were built and deployed. In 2017, here we go again. According to the hysteria currently sweeping Washington, the Russians are plotting to undermine the great American democracy. If satire wasn't dead, we'd be convulsing with laughter. In 2014, the US effectively overthrew its 56th government since the Second World War, many of them democracies. Do we know this? When Harold Pinter accepted the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2005, he compared and contrasted our knowledge of the crimes of the Soviet Union, about which we know a great deal, with the crimes of America, of which, and I quote him, never happened. Nothing ever happened. Even while it was happening, it wasn't happening. It didn't matter. It was of no interest, unquote. In 2014, the Obama administration overthrew the elected government in Ukraine. The coup was led by Europe's most active Nazis. In the Western media, this was converted to a Russian invasion. The American coup never happened. It didn't matter. It was of no interest. Since that coup in Ukraine, the greatest buildup of military forces in modern times has taken place along Russia's western border and in the Baltics. Not since Hitler's invasion in 1941 have foreign troops presented such a demonstrable threat to Russia. Norway, which has shared a peaceful border with Russia for centuries, is taking part in these provocative actions. One of America's so-called, quote, defensive missile shields is planned for the high north. Why? Why are Norwegian troops in the Baltics commanded by American generals? Why are US Marines in Norway? If I was a Norwegian, I would want to know why a leaked NATO document says that nuclear weapons preparations, once classified as not advisable, are now, and I quote, conceivable. The United States is preparing for a war with Russia and possibly China. Many of the safeguards on first strikes have been lifted. The US is committed to spending $12 trillion on nuclear weapons over the next 30 years. That's $46 million an hour, every hour, 24 hours a day. Is that news? No, it's not. At present, only propaganda is news, but this can change overnight with the first miscalculation, the first mistake, the first missile. A triumph for fake news is the tragedy of Syria, as Julian mentioned. The bloodletting in that country is not yet over. The Russians have moved on from their military victory to diplomacy, bringing together Iran, Turkey, and the Syrian government. That's the news. You wouldn't know it. It didn't happen, it didn't matter. Question the propaganda that has consumed most of the reporting of Syria in the West, and it's likely you'll be witch-hunted, even called a Holocaust denier. The suffering of Aleppo in Syria was a crusade by the media, yet almost no Western reporter witnessed it. For news, they relied on so-called rebels, many of whom were foreign jihadists, backed by the US and British governments. But Aleppo is two cities. Western Aleppo, held by Syria, was blown to bits by jihadists, but its suffering was not news, didn't happen, didn't matter, was of no interest. Double standards are the pillars of fake news. Syria's Assad is a murderous official enemy, whereas the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, reports The Guardian, is running a positive revolution and is bursting with, and I quote, a zeal for reform, unquote, words that might have been written by Burson Marsteller, the notorious New York public relations firm hired by the Saudis to correct their barbaric image. The zeal for reform might have also included Saudi's zeal for buying British and American weapons with which to kill children in Yemen. In the UK, every day we read or hear the word austerity. To most British people, austerity means the collective economic punishment of them, of millions of ordinary people. Services, hospitals, local councils, benefits are all cut to the bone. But austerity is fake news, a political and media construct and invention. In 2008, following the great financial crash, a rotten empire of capital was exposed. Banks and leading bankers were revealed as crooked. That was the real news. But after a few months, the media message changed. The rotten empire of capital disappeared and the public were diverted by something called austerity, which meant that the debt of the banks and the corporate crooks had become the burden of ordinary people. Many of the premises of civilized life in Britain were dismantled. These so-called austerity cuts amounted to more than £83 billion, which was almost exactly the amount of tax avoided by the same crooked banks and by corporations such as Amazon and Rupert Murdoch's News UK. In other words,